I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Delphine Collin-Vezina. Delphine is the director of the Center for Research on Children and Families at McGill University, a licensed clinical psychologist and a full professor at the McGill School of Social Work. She's also an associate member in the Department of Pediatrics, where she holds the Nicholas Steinmetz and Gil Strulian Chair in Community Social Pediatrics. She's the director of the Canadian Consortium on Child and Youth Trauma that regroups 110 researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and governmental representatives to better understand the impact of adverse and traumatic life events in the lives of children and youth, as well as their experiences with services geared towards them. Thank you so much for joining us today, Delphine, and I will now pass the floor to you.
It's truly a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who's attending the webinar today. I hope you're all doing well, keeping safe and well in any part of the country that you're joining us from. I'm joining you from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples. And in the work that I do in the trauma work, it's certainly very important to acknowledge, to do some land acknowledgement because of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the child protection system. So in Montreal, this was the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And I'm very grateful to be able to be working and living and raising my family on this land. So I will be sharing my slides, so please don't feel any obligation to take notes unless, there are many other things that I will be presenting as I go along. But these slides will be shared with you just right after the presentations. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Okay, so today we're together to talk about something that is quite difficult. And I'm convinced that there's a tremendous expertise and experiences in that Zoom call. You might be working in different areas, but probably working with children and youth who have been exposed to adverse experiences, or maybe you just want to learn about this reality. This is my passion. It's been for 25 years. I started working in this area when I was doing my PhD in clinical psychology, and I have to say that it took me some time before getting used to thinking about those very sad stories, but eventually it made my career so meaningful. I felt that there was something so important that had to be done regarding child maltreatment and the exposure to adverse childhood experiences, that I never left and maintained that commitment, that engagement towards improving services and policies for children and youth who've been exposed to very difficult experiences. So I assume that we are sharing a similar passion. And today I'll be focusing in that very brief presentation on the impact of trauma on early brain development and overall development as well. This webinar has some objectives, as you can see here, although it will certainly, we will just, cover those topics on the surface, but to look at the understanding of what it is, what is childhood trauma, and more specifically, what is complex trauma. You may have heard that term. It's becoming now a buzzword. So what is complex trauma? What do we know of the impacts of such an event or different events happening early on in childhood? And then we'll end with something probably a bit more positive about what can we do? And I'll present to you a model that we're implementing across different provinces in Canada and also abroad, that is coming from the US. It can be a very, I hope, an interesting source of inspiration for you. I have no conflict of interest to report, which is certainly very important, always important to note. So why does it matter is the first question we'll be focusing on for now. And I'll start with, so what is trauma? And And I could have chosen many different definitions because there are plenty. I chose that one from Bessel van der Kolk, who's a psychiatrist, American psychiatrist, who's one of the really, I would say, a handful of leaders in this field. And the way that he's describing it, I think really speaks to the heart as opposed to just reflecting on it from an intellectual standpoint. So from his words, trauma is an experience that leaves people frozen in a state of helplessness and terror. The mind and brain are overwhelmed, resulting in a change in how one perceives danger and what one considers relevant or irrelevant to survival. And we'll come back to this because trauma then becomes this kind of experience that will really shift a person's trajectory in life in a way that is very severe and very important. So when we talk about trauma, I think it's very important that we distinguish with kind of normal stressors. Life is not always an easy path or kind of with only joyful moments, and we will all end up experiencing many different types of stressors. Some of them are kind of healthy stressors because when we face a challenge, then we have to be creative and find ways to overcome the challenge. We may reach out to people. We may learn that when we talk about our difficulties, then people are there to support us, and it becomes a very good learning opportunity. So all stressors are not to be avoided completely. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about extreme stressors. And so we often refer to the term of toxic stress to really kind of bring this idea of stressor to that extreme point, which should be avoided. No child should be exposed to those stressors. And there's no healthy meaning to it to a certain extent. So what are we talking about more specifically is very well represented in that visual that is coming from NCSL. So they're talking about the pair of ACEs, and you may have heard that acronym because it's been used, to a great extent since the ACE study was conducted in the late 90s in the United States, and documenting for one of the very first times how prevalent traumatic experiences were in a very large population. So a very a landmark study. But here what they're doing is to distinguish between what we call adverse childhood experiences and adverse community environments. And one child can unfortunately accumulate those different forms of adversity. So when it comes to adverse childhood experiences, of course, we think about physical, psychological, sexual abuse. We think about different forms of neglect. We think about a parent who's struggling with substance abuse and mental health. We think about a parent who's incarcerated and various difficulties that are experienced within the family unit. But when it comes to adverse community environments, then it's kind of in the roots. And you have many other elements that can be extremely damaging for a child's development, including poverty, lack of social capital, poor housing, exposure to violence in the community, kind of discrimination and racism. And so all those different experiences can form what we consider to be potentially traumatizing, so a potential trauma for children and youth. Of course, not everyone accumulates all these different forms of trauma, but I'm sure that from your own practice, your own experience, we know that unfortunately, there's some children and youth who have quite a heavy baggage, and they accumulate those different forms of ACEs. So the question I have for you as just a way to make it more lively and engaging is, the prevalence that you think is present in our own society. So here you have the Canadian community health survey that was conducted 10 years ago. So that means that in Canada, we don't include those questions very often in surveys that we conduct. We don't monitor or document traumatic experiences very often in national surveys. That's the very best data we have, because it was from a very representative sample of Canadians. And the question was about whether people had experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, and or exposure to domestic violence before the age of majority. And so I'm questioning you in terms of what, in your opinion, was the proportion of Canadians who reported one and or more of those experiences. Do you think that it's 8%, 21%, or 32%? And so there will be a poll that should come your way just in a minute. Yes, I can see it. Okay, I see that 61 people answered, and now it might be time to end the poll. And I will share results. You're probably seeing now the results, which is very interesting. So the majority thought that it's 32%, but very close to this, many of you thought it was 21%. And very few people thought it was as low as 8%. So we're going to look at those numbers, that number. And in fact, so the majority of the people in the audience had the correct answer. It's 32%. So if we just sit with that idea just for 1 second, it really means that one in three Canadians reported sexual abuse, physical abuse, and or exposure to domestic violence before the age of 18. This is not a thorough assessment of all ACEs possible at the family unit or community level. Those are only 3 questions, 3 potential adverse childhood experiences that are well known to be severe and well known to be potentially very traumatizing. But it's not even it's not thorough by any means, and still we have 1 in 3. So when we think about the initial question, why does it matter? I hope that number is a very good rationale for why we should all be together today and to talk about trauma. Because if 1 in 3 people have experienced only those 3 experiences, it means that it concerns us all. It's a public health issue and not just a problem that is specific to a certain population, to people that are struggling because of different elements in their social context. It is everyone's business. So going a bit further in terms of understanding then, so from that set of knowledge to complex trauma, what is the link between those two? I'll go into what it is in terms of the complex trauma field. So that term, complex trauma, was coined in 1992 by Judith Herman, who's a psychiatrist in the United States. And it became extremely well recognized quickly because everyone could agree that there was a gap in the way we were describing trauma that was originally very much framed around the experience of going to war or having a car accident, and that those were absolutely potentially traumatizing experiences that were leading to post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, but that there was something more to be understood when it came to experiences happening within the family system, like maltreatment type experiences that was not exactly the same as having a car accident. And so this is why this idea of complex trauma emerged and became very much part of the overall discourse when it comes to understanding very specific types of experiences as part of that tree that I showed. So complex trauma are considered experiences that are by nature interpersonal. So it's a human being hurting another human being. It's not just bad luck. When you have a car accident, you can say, this is not my fault. It's not because I'm not as good as a human being than other people. It's because I was really at the wrong place, right time. It's bad luck. And it may take me time to recover from it, both physically and psychologically. But the core aspect of my self-esteem and sense of worth might still be preserved, because it's not as if I did something to create that. When it comes to being physically abused, being psychologically abused, like being called names, being said, you're stupid. If that is part of your experience when you're growing up, how can you think that it's not personalized? You are being attacked. It's not just bad luck. So it really involves this idea of betrayal. There's some people that should take care of you, and maybe they do to a certain extent, but they also create harm. And that really creates something very, very unique in a child's development. We also want to refer to complex trauma when it comes to experiences that are chronic or prolonged, that it's not a one-time event. It doesn't mean that a one-time event is not, again, potentially traumatizing. But when it comes to complex trauma, we want to refer to the idea that it spans over a long period. So for children, they feel unsafe. They feel unprotected over a long period of time. And that will have a very specific impact, again, on their development. It involves direct harm. So there are different forms of maltreatment that can also be compounded by other forms of adverse community experiences. But there are also some direct harm being done to the child. And we also want to see that complex traumas are experiences that often occur at very early on in life when a child is building their social and affective and cognitive capacities. And so it will shape their trajectory in a very specific way. Although we also know that experiences that are very severe that happen later on in life can unfortunately undermine some developmental gains or steps that were already acquired. And so children going backward in their development, unfortunately. So it's not as if you have a window from 0 to 6 and then everything else won't have an impact. The impact can be present at any time, but I'm sure that we can all recognize that when it happens very early, it's a very sensitive period in the child's development. So before we move to kind of the mental health challenges that we can associate with those events, I just wanted to say that what is the core? What is the most crucial impact of those experiences? And I think that the best way to present it is to refer to the idea of an impaired sense of safety. How can you trust? How can you feel safe in your family, in school, in your community, when you've been hurt, when your dignity has not been maintained, when your rights were infringed? How can you maintain a sense of safety? And so these children at the core will develop a kind of an alarm system that can be easily triggered by so many different things. And I think this idea, the comparison with the school bus, I think is the right one, because do you see how many danger zones there are for a school bus? It seems like it's it's a complete danger to be around a school bus. And it's probably similar for children who've gone through a lot of traumatic experiences over a long period of time. It's as if everything is a potential for danger. And so they become hypersensitive to cues. They become hyper alert. They react way too much to things that seem from the outside as being very trivial and minor. But it's not really us to judge whether this is a true danger. It is felt as real by the child because of their experiences being hurt and being maltreated. So I hope that, that can stay with you, because when we usually talk about the impact of trauma, we don't get really to that more emotional place. And we need to, if we want to become more sensitive to their experience and be more empathetic, we need also to try to get to see it from their own perspective and what the kind of impairments that it created. Because usually we talk about the impact more through that kind of lens. And it's not to say it's not important, of course, but I wanted to present first kind of the school bus analogy before going into this. So now 2023, we have tons of studies and very robust studies showing an impact, kind of the relationship between exposure to childhood trauma and all those challenges that you can see here across almost every domain of a child's development. Emotions, relationships, mental health, behavior, even brain development, cognition, and physical health. And I'm not going to go into details describing all of them, but just want to say that now there's really this very solid research evidence backing, really identifying that it is a risk factor, so that it increases the odds of presenting all of those challenges. It's not a specific factor. We don't have, for instance, a specific physical abuse is not a specific determinant of a specific mental health challenge. It acts with other environmental and genetic factors. So no doubt that it's not a direct link, but it's a significant link. And the more a child has been exposed to different experiences, the more likely they are to present with those challenges. So just wanted to kind of focus a bit more on the brain and cognition, because that was the purpose of today's presentation. And what we know, again, really with solid, very robust research, is that the exposure to trauma affects the structure, the chemistry, the function of the brain. And the two sections that we know, and we will know more than that in the years to come. There's so many interesting studies underway, but we know at least that there are two sections that are particularly impacted by trauma: the limbic system, so our stress response system, and the prefrontal cortex. That is also known to be quite impacted by early experiences. So just want to say in a nutshell what we know about those elements. So when it comes to the limbic system, we have research evidence demonstrating that for shared complex trauma, what I described, when it's chronic, when it's prolonged in very important relationships, occurring very early on, unfortunately, it's very likely for these children to present with alterations of their stress response system, so the HPA axis, and particularly we measure that through their cortisol level. What we get to see is that they have abnormal cortisol levels, but it's either too high, so it remains too high, even if the child doesn't seem to be still in a danger zone, or it's abnormally low. And those two trends are equally frequent in research. And we know that there are problems associated with both. So that's one aspect. When we test, for instance, morning level cortisol, there will be kind of a distinction between the groups with complex trauma and other children, youth, similar age and gender. What we know also is that their stress response is no longer in keeping with the situation. We all know that the stress response system is an amazing alarm that keeps us safe and alive. So we need to have that system. I need to be able to run very fast if there's something happening in my building. And so wonderful to have that system, but it needs to be in keeping with what is happening. If I start to produce too much cortisol and I'm just sitting here and talking to you, there's something off that will happen. I won't be able to present the same way as I'm presenting to you. There will be all different, the activity in my body will be modified so that I can really face and fight the danger, but there's no real danger happening now. So that's really a problem as well that we were able to document in research. And so not surprisingly, these are kids that are very often described as being either very prompt and overreactive, as if just a little single stressor is creating an enormous reaction, or at the opposite, they can be described as being very detached, not able even to detect danger. And we can associate those reactions to their level of cortisol. So that's for the limbic system. What we know from the prefrontal cortex is that these are kids that are showing very important impairments in their executive functions and self-regulatory abilities that we know are the mental processes that allow us to plan, to focus, to concentrate, to be able to remember instructions, maybe to focus on what I'm saying right now, as opposed to something else that is happening in your surrounding. We need to use those mental processes on a day-to-day basis, almost every minute. And I like this analogy that is from Harvard University. And just kind of talking about executive functioning as the air traffic control system that really needs to manage the arrivals and departures, many planes on multiple runways. And so it's similar with the brain, who needs this skill set to filter out distractions, prioritize tasks, set and achieve goals, and control impulses. So what we know, and the reason why there's such a link between exposure to trauma and deficits in executive functioning, is that children are born with a potential to develop executive functions, but they're not born with those skills already built. They're built in relationship. They're built with experience. So if those experiences are absolutely negative, then it becomes way too difficult for a child to develop very high level executive functions. And the child is left alone wondering and trying to build those skills without the scaffolding that is really needed to achieve this goal. So not surprisingly, we get to see in many children who've gone through trauma that they have significant deficits related to executive functioning. And you have a few here that are the ones that have been very well documented. So adjusting between activities, how can you adjust when you're running in the schoolyard and then you have to put yourself in line and keep quiet? And very often we're asking that of children to, like, in a second, they should be now in line and quiet. But that requires many skills to be able to navigate from one state of arousal to the other. And so that's a real challenge for them. And they're being punished and they're being criticized for not being able to comply with those rules. But often it's because really it's not possible for them to follow the rules as it is asked of them. Having difficulty getting organized, being very rigid, in their ideas, having difficulty shifting from one idea to the other. What to focus on can be quite a challenge. They can make careless mistakes, and they can have difficulty with kind of self-awareness, self-assessment. You need to have very good mentalization skills to be able also to kind of reflect on your own behaviors and emotions, and that is really a challenge for them. So I'm sure that at this stage you're wondering, so then what's the difference with mental health, just mental health? And I'm presenting here just one example. This is certainly the question that we all have in mind in this field. It's, so then what is about trauma? So if a child is presenting with different problems, is it because of trauma? Is it because it's a mental health problem that is due, caused by so many other factors? And here you have the example with ADHD, because I was presenting symptoms that are certainly very much alike those that we're looking at when we want to investigate about a potential ADHD in a child. So you see that there are a few symptoms that are considered to be probably more related to trauma. For instance, feelings of fear, kind of trying to avoid some reminders of trauma, being quick to anger, more specific to trauma. Others that are maybe more specific to ADHD, and unfortunately that overlap. And this is why it becomes it's so complicated to think about a diagnostic, to think about, what's the best way to represent the challenge that this child is presenting with. And very often we don't necessarily have a quick answer to this. So just wanted to highlight that that question is of utmost relevance, but we haven't yet found the perfect answer. But here you have an interesting document. So is it ADHD or child traumatic stress? That is from the National Child Trauma Stress Network, which is really also a leading authority in this field. So if you're interested. So what can be done? Just want to end with a kind of a positive spin to this presentation, because we're talking about very difficult experiences that children may have been exposed to. So what can be done? There's certainly a movement towards trauma-informed care approaches. And that's also another buzzword and that we refer to very often by its acronym TIC. So a trauma-informed care approach aims to influence policy and practice. So it's not just direct services, it's also about how we frame, it's also at the organizational level with different organizational policies that will allow for practices to be implemented as well. So I think this is already a very important piece to have in mind, because it's not just on the shoulders of practitioners then to become trauma-informed. It's about organizations to become trauma-informed as well. And so those policies and practices will focus on this idea of the awareness of the prevalence of trauma, that we want people to become sensitive, that the same as I did showing you that it's 30% of Canadians. So we try to unpack that and make sure that people don't perceive it as, oh, of course, if you're working in inpatient psychiatry, of course, then you need to be trauma-informed. No, it's everyone should be trauma-informed, because just in the regular school classroom, there are many kids who've gone through a lot of trauma. If you work in first-line mental health services, many people will have had this experience as well. So it's kind of everyone, to bring everyone with a similar awareness and sensitivity to this. Understand the impact of trauma. So the graph that I showed, we can also spend time unpacking what does that mean, so that we don't focus too heavily just on the behavior. Our systems are extremely reactive to misbehaviors, and kids are being, looked at and serviced very often due to their misbehaviors, but how can we go beyond that and make sure that we have a more holistic perspective? And then to have a clear commitment to incorporate this knowledge into kind of at each level. So it's not a minor undertaking. This is the piece that is very important to have in mind. It's a shift in culture. If we're not punitive to children if they misbehave in school, what do we do? If a child is saying bad words and just behaving in ways that are completely disruptive, what do we do if it's not to expel that child? Or so then it becomes a real shift in culture. How do we structure our routines so that it provides opportunities for children to feel suited in the system that we're inviting them to join? So it's not a minor undertaking, and it's a process where we hope that people will shift a little bit from what's wrong with this kid, what's that child's problem, to what happened in this young person's life. How can we better support, guide, and love him, her, in terms of kind of what is that the responsibility we can take? And so in order to do that, the model that we use in our program is the ARC framework. ARC stands for Attachment, Regulation, and Competencies. It was created by a clinical psychologist and social worker in the United States. It's considered an evidence-based. Now it's moving towards evidence-based, but certainly promising practice, but very soon to be considered like with the kind of like a gold standard. And the reason why I think this one is particularly interesting is that it's not a psychotherapy. It's an approach that can be integrated by people that are not necessarily doing very specialized PTSD clinical work. It is for everyone. And for instance, in the work that we do implementing that framework in group homes, let's say, a residential care facilities, we train the security guards. We train the person who's cooking in the unit, not only the specialized clinical team. So we have a common language, and everyone feels that they have a responsibility to help these children to heal and to thrive. It clearly, the ARC model is hoping to rebuild some resilience across those three domains of functioning. So attachment, believing that you can trust others, that you can feel safe in relationship, giving children some mastery over their emotions, capacities to regulate a little bit better this kind of affective world, and to develop different areas of competencies. So here, and I will end my talk very soon and take questions. Here is probably the most important slide of today's presentation because it presents the ARC model in a nutshell. This is what we do when we work with ARC, is to find ways to develop opportunities for growth that is completely individualized, personalized to one child across those different building blocks. You have a first level that is not necessarily with kind of goals, clinical goals, but this is something you want to bear in mind every minute that you're working with a child. Engagement speaks about who believes in that child. How can we make sure that hope towards another future is conveyed to the child? How can we make sure relationships where there's a little bit more trust can be nurtured, and we can promote those relationships so that engagement is being shown by adults surrounding the child, so the child can eventually internalize that engagement as well. Education is about how much do we know about that child's life? How can we be sensitive to that child's history? How can we share information in a way that is respectful of the child's privacy, but still will allow us to have another perspective of that child. And routines and rhythms, again, how can we create safe haven through our own systems and services, and make sure that we have ways for them to feel that things can be predictable, they can be reassured by our own capacities to organize different days and weeks. Then we move on to the attachment building blocks. Before we ask the child to manage their emotions, what is the caregiver's affect management capacities? So we're talking about teachers and even ourselves as clinicians. It might be about foster families or workers in group homes. How are they reacting to that child, and how can they develop more soft skills and their own capacities to mentalize and to be more reflective. Attunement is about how can we be aware of the different triggers, the danger zones. Effective response is about how can we make sure that we don't get too punitive. What are other ways to help children learn that there's some social expectations, but how can we not get into the hole of being just more and more punitive towards those children, which will lead us to be able to go to the regulation building blocks, help the child better identify emotions and modulate those emotions better, kind of the volume of those emotions and to bring it a bit lower. And then to develop different aspects of competency. You see here executive functioning, so different ideas on how to provide opportunities to rebuild those skills, to provide the scaffolding, because it's not because they were not able to develop those skills before that it's just the end point. There's always some flexibility. How can we help them develop a sense of identity that is more positive, and also to develop their own social abilities and create and nurture relational links. So in here, just as a final note, the ARC model is not an intervention where we do a trauma narrative. So this is why it's not considered a psychotherapy. We don't talk about trauma. A child might invite a conversation about their traumatic experiences, and we won't say no to that. But the purpose of the intervention is not for them to talk about their traumatic experiences. And so this is why it is so inclusive, and it brings everyone around the child together with the same lens, this house that you see, because everyone can have a role to play in this. So trauma integration is done through those reflections around building blocks. If you're interested in trauma-informed care, complex trauma, I have here a list of resources that I think are just phenomenal from different countries. It's an international movement, this is for sure. I want to promote our own because we do have, as part of the Canadian Consortium on Child and Youth Trauma that I am the director of, we have a portal, and you can find in both French and English resources for caregivers about complex trauma, like infographics, different elements that are very easy to understand and to engage with. And we have also resources for practitioners. So something maybe that you're interested in. And so before I turn it over for questions, I think I hope that in my presentation, it came across that it is terribly sad to acknowledge how prevalent trauma is, but this is the reality, and it's the first step in order to make any change in our society. We need to fully acknowledge that. And the impact of trauma can be tremendous and across all domains. When it comes to the brain, we know, at least for now, that there are two main structures that are impacted by trauma: limbic system and prefrontal cortex. and that there are some approaches that can that do value this kind of holistic, kind of whole person approach, and can provide opportunities for growth and for healing and for resilience for those children and youth who had a very rough start in life, but that can also be helped so that they can thrive and they can come back to a more kind of optimal level of development. And hopefully we can all play a part in that. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll invite any questions you have.
Thank you, Delphine. You certainly made me more trauma-informed.
I'm so glad then.
Yeah, just the statistics, and also I really appreciated that you raised the idea of being curious behind, those behaviors that are challenging, of course, in our services. And you provide answers, you provide cues. And I know there are probably many questions, but I would have only one for you. The ARC model. Do I understand that we could implement it in a group in our child services for all children, not knowing if some children are maybe more have experienced trauma or not? Understanding the relationship and all, your model is great. So there's training, we could receive training and implement it in our child services?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. It's true that it's, in fact, a universal program, because I do collaborate, as you may imagine, with Child Protection Services. So that was the starting point of implementing the ARC model, with, again, foster families, training them through the ARC model and see how they can implement those strategies in their home. Then with workers in group homes and residential care facilities, but also with workers in units serving young offenders as well. And so the ARC model was truly just a way to revisit practices, to make sure that there was a common vision, less blaming, less focused on the behavior. And then from there, I became also involved in implementing the ARC model in school settings. So in school settings, they don't have the information about trauma. Very often it's something that is completely unknown. And you don't need to have a full history of a child's trauma to be able to use the ARC model. If you have children who haven't been exposed to trauma, to have a more thoughtful routine for them, to have people with hand, to their needs, to build stronger regulation skills, executive functioning, it will just be a bonus. It will just be a plus. And so this is why it's true. It's not specific to only children who've gone through a lot of trauma, but what it does is that it makes an enormous difference for those who've been through trauma, and the kind of more mainstream system that we have that is assuming that they can, like if they really wanted, they could. This kind of assumption is potentially very traumatizing again for these children. So implementing ARC truly makes a difference for these children and will do no harm for the other ones.
Absolutely.
Like, so
it provides
those
ingredients, right, in the
That's
early
right.
years about, building relationship and trust. So it's good for all children, but then you provide what's needed for those children we don't know maybe that are
Exactly.
trauma, and
Exactly.
those, yes, we know. Thank you. I know there are questions. I would have so many others, but I will leave the others to ask their questions.
Thank you, Delphine. Thank you, Isabel. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat. I can read it out to you, Delphine. The first one is wondering from Erin has put a comment, wondering if there's information or resources available connecting to autism and in utero and infancy trauma.
Wow, that's a very good one. I'm going to try to find so there's also this the diagram, the Venn diagram that I showed contrasting trauma and PTSD, as you may imagine, there's a lot of attention now given to how can we distinguish trauma, attachment disorder, and autism, and especially in the early years, because those are very easily, symptoms can be very similar. And so I can really stand this resource that I just came across. What I know from my own experience in clinical practice is that I have tons of respect for psychiatrists and other physicians that will take time before kind of really labeling the issue as being autism or something else in the early years, because very often these children, we have no way to fully understand what is the cause of those symptoms that we get to see, and allowing some time. For instance, a child we know had gone through trauma is now placed in a foster family. Maybe that foster family will take some months before really building a trust relationship, and for the child to really feel that they can no longer be hypervigilant or being withdrawn from relationships. So we need to allow ourselves to observe, to take notes, and to see whether those symptoms that we get to see early on that look like full autism, will they remain over time? And then can we really confirm that this is autism, this is what it is, and trauma is just adding up, but the true condition that this child has is autism, or is it truly trauma? And I haven't seen anything better than observing and allowing time. But I know that there's one tool, and it's the Coventry. I will find it. I know that I can find it in 10 seconds. But I see that also there's another question from Erin, so I want to make sure that I have time for that.
Yes, Erin, you have your hand up. Do you have a follow-up question?
I do. So I'm actually currently working with a family who we've done the observing, and we've watched all this flourishing happen. And it's been really incredible to watch until he was diagnosed with mom present with the ASD. And when asked about trauma, mom froze. And because I wasn't able to be there to advocate, she's also in a court case, and the lawyer's saying, well, we need proof. We need proof this is trauma, or else it's HSASD. So not that any of this is going to hold up in court, but I'm just trying to compile enough information for the doctor to maybe revisit the diagnosis with some speculations to offer in that case as well. So whatever resources or links that are available, I would greatly appreciate.
Yeah, so I will. So I'm glad, because I think, well, it's the best one I've seen. I haven't seen one looking at exposure to substances intrautero and trauma, so that I would not be able to comment on that. Although if we think of executive functioning, for instance, we know that prenatal experiences can also alter those capacities that are just emerging. And then trauma, if that occurs, I can only just imagine that they probably collapsed together to create something even more severe than if a child had experienced only one or the other. It's the severity probably that I would assume is even more, but what is due to one, what is due to the other one, to disentangle is so complex and so difficult. So I can still kind of recommend that grid. So I was close, Coventry grid interview. And if you Google that, you'll see that it's really to try to have a differential diagnosis between autism spectrum disorder and attachment problems. So at least it can bring that level.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
And we have one more question, but just before that, I'd also like to just remind everyone that we'll be sending the slides to people who registered. It will have the links and information. We'll also try to add anything that we can think of after this, I think, to resources we send out. Delphine, just one more question, and I think we're up against the time. The question is, in your practice, do you include diet, nutritional supplements, herbs, activity as part of the healing process?
Thank you for that question. It's certainly something that could be so easily integrated into the ARC model. And because when we talk about routines, it's about taking care of our basic needs. And how to be able to enjoy a meal. How do you enjoy? That can be completely impaired because of exposure to violence in the family. So in my own capacity, I might not recommend, for instance, a special nutritional supplements because I don't know enough about that. But it's something that would be considered as part of looking at a very holistic wellness approach. And activity will be considered. How can we make sure that this child has moments of that coincide with their levels of arousal? And how can we promote different activities, walking in the land, just doing many forms of activities. I have great also collaborators from indigenous communities helping me thinking about how we can bring those the indigenous ways of healing into also an ARC approach. And thus far, what I hear from my colleagues is that these two approaches, they go together very well because the ARC model is not prescriptive. It's not you should do that and that and that. It's about can we reflect on, can we think, can we open ideas to just better help that specific child. And so that specific child, we might consider a specific diet to help that child because we think this is the best way to promote healing. So absolutely. So I don't necessarily do it myself, but the ARC model would certainly invite this kind of conversation.
Thank you so much. I think we're at the end of the session. We have just a few more minutes for some housekeeping and some information that may be of interest to people who would like to stay. Thank you, Delphine, for a really great presentation, really great information in there. I'm sure that it has really, provided food for thought and action. And thank you, Isabel, for raising some insightful points as well that I'm sure added some dimensions to this. And thank you to everyone who joined and stayed. You will find the survey link for your certificates of participation, if you would like, in the chat box. If you would like more resources related to trauma and violence approaches, please do take a look at the resources that Delphine mentioned, but also on our websites, Families Canada and the encyclopedia. We do have some related information as well. And just for your information, I'd like to share that we do have some activities going on as this is the end of March. We have our March sale and it is ending soon, but we have some great resources and training for up to half the price available. So I hope you would take, if you need to, be able to take advantage of that. We're going to be putting some links in the chat that also may be of interest to you from both Families Canada and the encyclopedia and CCD. So once again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Delphine and Isabel. It's a great session, and we hope to see you again in coming webinars like this.